Good evening. You'll turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Something to know about me. One of the things that I like to do is I like to look at lessons that I've heard all my life. I'm the son of a preacher, so I've heard a lot of sermons. And I like to look at those topics and say, what is another way I can think about this? Or what is something that we don't often consider about this topic or this event? And I want us to do that tonight, and hopefully we will come to a conclusion tonight that's going to help us with our everyday life. If you've already turned to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and what a lot of people do is they'll start reading a little bit, see where we are, what's going on, you'll probably notice that we are getting ready to talk about the sin of David and Bathsheba. And what we see is in verse 1, David is supposed to be out to battle, apparently. It says at the time when kings go out to battle, but David decides not to go, and he gets himself in a lot of trouble. And not only does that one night happen, but then Uriah happens. And if David could have just gotten Uriah home, nobody would have been the wiser. But Uriah, being a righteous and good-natured man, has to muck it all up. So David has to take care of him. And every time I read through this passage, sometimes I ask the question to myself, and really to the Holy Spirit, because I'd really like to know, what about Abigail? We don't really know much about David's wife, Ahinoam, but we know quite a bit about Abigail. And by all accounts, Ahinoam and Abigail are still alive and still his wives at this point in time. Nathan says as much, at the very least, in his parable, that he has sheep aplenty, but had to take someone else's lamb. And I always want to ask this question, what about Abigail? Because she's nowhere in here. Her children are going to become part of this story later on, not with Bathsheba in particular, but we read about children that she's had. Let's remind ourselves about Abigail very quickly. We see her first in 1 Samuel chapter 25. She's married to a man named Nabal, who treats David very wickedly. And at the end of 1 Samuel 25, her husband dies. And when David finds out about that, after all the events that had gone on, he decides that he should take her as a wife, which how we come to know her in 1 Samuel 25 was a really wise choice on David's part, And then we see in chapter 27 that she and Ahinoam are mentioned as living with David when he flees from Saul and goes to live with the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 27. And then we find in chapter 30 that the Amalekites come in and raze the city of Ziklag, which is where David and his men were living. And she, along with Ahinoam, their children, all of David's other men's wives and children, and everyone's possessions in Ziklag are all taken, and by God's providence, they get them all back. And then we never hear about her anymore, except whenever it tells us which children she bore to David. So it begs the question, as we read through 2 Samuel 11 and 12, why then talk about Abigail? And what we need to stop and remember is about what sin ultimately is. What is sin? If you'll turn with me to the book of James. Here in chapter 1 of the book of James, he's talking about how we are saved by our faith. And then James goes on in the rest of chapter 1 and on into the rest of his book about what a faith that saves us, a faith that saves us actually looks like. But at the beginning of chapter 1, he talks about what it looks like when we don't have faith, when we lack faith. And in verse 14, each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. And this is not a quick process. Sin is something that eats away at us. It's something that it's not an event, it's a corrupting force. I think sometimes we think of sin as just an action. No, it is something that eats away at us when we don't get rid of it. Have you ever seen people tear down a house that had termites in it? Has anyone ever gotten to see that before? Because one, it's really gross. And two, it's also really cool. But as you're tearing the walls apart in particular, and you're getting to the lumber underneath, and what you start finding is so much of the house is just holding itself up by the wood shavings that are left. And as you start taking the drywall apart, you'll have dust just pouring out sometimes. And then those termites, they're still there. They're everywhere. And so sometimes you'll tear down a piece of drywall and the wall's alive. And it's very sickening to look at. But here's the thing. Nobody just dumped a whole mess of termites on top of the house. There was a line of termites that found their way into the house and then slowly started eating away at the house. To the point that the house will no longer stand. You have to tear the whole thing down and start back over. And that is what sin is when it gets its hooks in there. You have to tear the whole thing down and start over. And when we were looking this morning about, we get so focused on what I'm not allowed to do. What God says I'm not allowed to do. But I'm an adult and I should be able to do what I want. God says, no, because I know that sin in your life is just a little termite and it won't take long at all. It takes its time. But once you get that termite in there, we had the house that we just moved from, we had a huge wood pile outside the house. And it was a brick house, which is probably why the previous owners left it there. But the first thing we did when we got into the house was we started moving the wood pile because we wanted this wood pile away from the house. It was the whole house long and about 4 feet high. So probably at that wall, you're probably looking at maybe 50 feet. So 50 feet long and about 4 feet high, just all wood. And just staring at it, I thought, how many termites could be in this? And we treated for termites, and when we were talking to the exterminator, he said, in a span of 3 months, termites can get into one house and then reach an area that is as long as 3 football fields in either direction from that house in 3 months. And it's just devastating to not only your house, but the houses that are around you. That's really what I want us to focus on tonight. Sometimes we get in our minds, a little sin is just a little sin. All it's really doing is just affecting me. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a little sin that only affects you. This is something that actually comes up in the legal system a lot, victimless crimes. And there are a few crimes that fit that definition of victimless crimes, particularly if one or more people are involved of their own accord and something happens and it doesn't affect anybody outside of the people that have agreed to the action. However, what we start to find is things can go from victimless sins to destroying your whole life very quickly. Sometimes they often even start without anything actually bad. Maybe unwise, but not sinful. And that is just that one little termite that's gotten in there. But then, as we saw here, each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Well, that little thing that was just a temptation, that little thing that you noticed, you took note of, but then you started looking into it, and then you started pursuing it, and then you find yourself in the middle of it. And what is it that always is said? And then before I knew it. Really? Before you knew it? Because we started even before this. Who was supposed to know about David and Bathsheba? Maybe the servants that went and got her. But from any of David's family, any of Bathsheba's family, who would have known? And then it all steamrolled over David. What started as something rather innocent became so much more. And maybe it wasn't so innocent to begin with, but, well, she's just coming to the palace. So all of a sudden, we're murdering people on the front lines of battle. Any sin in our life, it could be one little termite, but you let it go, and you let it go, and you let it go, and suddenly your life is crumbling around you. And this is something that we just saw with, Jill and I just saw with a couple of friends of ours. Suddenly the other day, just posts. By the way, no longer married to my husband. Please pray for our family as we go through infidelity. And it's two people that you wouldn't have thought, as it often happens. Never would have thought it. But those termites are really hard to see when they're on their own. But when you have a whole mess of them, it's ugly. And it doesn't take long for them to multiply. Sin in our life, even if the sin, quote unquote, only affects me, something I do in the privacy of wherever, no one else can see me, it doesn't involve anybody else, I promise you there are victims. The people that are around you will start to feel the effects of what you're doing in private. And not only does it affect those closest to you, it'll also start to affect those who are a few steps removed from you. They'll start to feel the effects, particularly outside of your nuclear family. Your church family, if the church is being who they're supposed to be, are going to start feeling the effects of this sin. Because again, a virus can get into your body with one microbe, and suddenly you're very ill. And this is something that God has been warning us since the beginning of time. If you'll turn back to Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis 1, he talks about creating man in his own image. He charges us with something. He says, everything is good. And after he creates all of this, in chapter 3, we see the serpent comes to Eve and says, "Indeed has God said, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden." The woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die." The serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And of course, what the serpent doesn't tell her is how right he is. Now, we were already made in the image of God, but here, this was really the crux of the choice that God gave Adam and Eve in the garden. It wasn't to eat or not eat. I think we make that mistake sometimes. To eat or not to eat. That wasn't the choice. Trust God or don't. That was the choice. And every time we come to sin, we face the same thing. We look at Adam and Eve and we go, how stupid are you? You had everything. You had God right there with you. You could eat of anything else that you wanted. But Eve started looking through the eyes of the petulant child, like we talked about earlier this morning. That one thing I can't have is the one thing I want. And now it becomes a matter of satisfaction. Well, that looks very satisfying. And it wasn't about eating. It was about, are you going to trust God or not? And every time you face sin, you have the same question. Am I going to trust God or not? And whenever we fall, we said, you know what? I'm not going to trust God. And then we fall, and God just stands there. I told you. I don't know. I told you that was going to happen. But the beautiful thing about God is, as we stand, may lie there on the ground, God then gives us a choice. Because we're human beings, this crossroad of trust God or not comes up a lot. We find ourselves on the ground a lot. And the beautiful thing is, God stands there, and the real choice is, are you going to get up or not? At first, the choice was, am I going to trust God or not? And then we failed. But then he asks, are you going to get up or not? And those are your only two options. I'm either going to get up, and I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to go back to God, or I'm going to stay there and I'm going to wallow in my misery. And the longer you lay there, the muddier you're going to get. And not only the muddier you're going to get, you're going to spread that filth everywhere. And now everyone becomes affected by your little sin. It is a corrupting force, and there's a reason why Jesus said, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. There is no such thing as victimless sin. And once we finally figure that out, if you remember a few sermons ago, I know, sometimes I can't remember what I had for breakfast. A few sermons ago, we talked about 1 Corinthians 13. And Paul said, the greatest of any of our endeavors in life is love to be the center of our life. If we're loving people around us, then sin is harder to commit. Because no one is victimless in my sin. Do you want that affecting your spouse? Do you want that sin affecting your children? Do you want that sin affecting your parents? Maybe the rest of your congregation? Do you really want that to spread, that filth across all those people in your life? The answer has to be, if you really love people, if you're really going to be good to people, if you're really going to be kind and caring to people, then we're going to decide to trust God. And whenever we fall, we're going to decide to get up. And hopefully, as you go about your life, you're always thinking, how is this going to affect others around me? Because I promise every single choice you make does. And it may not feel like it. Sometimes the choice of whether I eat bacon or sausage for breakfast may not really affect many people around us. But as we move through our day, we come across more and more and more choices. And remember, all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 11, what was the first thing that happened to David? He didn't go when he was apparently supposed to go. Who cares? David didn't go. Joab will be just fine. I'm going to stay at home. I'm going to relax. And boy, howdy, the rug got ripped out from under him, didn't it? As we go through our daily life, think about every single choice you make. And then think, how is this going to affect everyone around me? And here's the thing. You do that tomorrow. You do that tomorrow. Think about every single choice that you're going to make. You will be exhausted by the end of the day. But what you'll start to notice is just how many of your choices affect everyone else around you. How I respond to someone. The speed I'm going down the highway. What if I get to work 5 minutes late? All these things, they don't seem like much. But it gathers and it gathers and it gathers. And suddenly you find yourself in a place I never thought I'd be. Tonight, what you need to do is you need to evaluate where you stand with God. It's the first thing. Evaluate where you stand with God. Take a second. Where do you stand with God? If you don't like where you're standing, do something about it right now. Because all we have to do is get up. When Peter is sinking into the sea after he's been walking on it, it says all Jesus did was reach out. He was right there. Jesus just reached down and picked him up. And that's what God is always doing. When you decide, I'm going to make things right, God said, okay, great. My hand's been here the whole time. And he'll pick you up, and we'll do whatever we can to help. If you actually are pleased with your standing with God, then I want you to start thinking about the next couple of days. What's going to happen? How am I going to actively seek to keep sin out of my life? This is an active thing, to keep sin out of your life. It doesn't just happen. You have to be wary and watchful. And so think about what that's going to be looking like the next couple of days. In whatever way we need to help each other, please take advantage of this opportunity as we stand and as we sing.